Thank you very much, Paul. So, as Paul said, Maria and I started a long time ago, and we went to school together at University of Southern California in the 80s. And what brought us together was a love of nature. And the one thing that we learned in those years in the 80s, at the height of postmodernism, if you recall that, was the conflict that man had with nature. We love making things, and we love getting involved. And our cultures, me from Singapore and Maria from Mexico City, was really a real indicator of the way the world was going. It was moving eventually towards Asia. We could already see that. And when we were at Harvard, at Graduate School of Design, we encountered a very Eurocentric mentality and approach. And Maria and I, we were very much into nature, emotion, the intangibles. And this really was an issue until we met this man. He was our teacher at Harvard. And we learned one thing from Tadao Ando, and that was resistance, to walk your own path. And this is exactly what Maria and I did. We moved back to Asia. We lived in Japan for a few years before settling back down in Singapore and started raising a family in the early 90s. And there started our journey. Fast forward 10 years. After 10 years of practice in big firms, I worked for Nick & Seke, Maria ran her own little practice. We started WOW Architects and Warner Wong Design in the year 2000. And we immediately set about correcting what we thought was wrong. We wanted to embrace nature. We wanted to embrace the senses. We wanted to talk about experience. And we wanted to talk about diversity of culture, memory, and places. So that really was the center point of what we wanted to do. Fast forward another 10 years, right through the whole period of when sustainability came to the forefront of design, we realized that it wasn't enough. If you accept the fact that our planet is damaged, you don't sustain a damaged planet, you repair it. And so for the last at least 25 years, regenerative design has become the centerpiece of the WOW ethos. So I trace back now in a sort of semi-chronological order the kind of work that we did and where we are today. In the first 10 years, we talked about integrating architecture, landscape, and interior design for a total sensory experience. We were very keen on doing everything, much to the annoyance of hotel operators and clients who always had silos. If you're an architect, you do architecture. So we wanted to create architectural experiences with a landscape and environmental focus, particularly environmental focus, and using landscape paradigms as the primary conceptual driver. We found a willing client in Taj Hotels, who commissioned us to do this project, the Vivanta by Taj in Bangalore, where we had opportunity to really create, for the first time, a totally integrated experience. And we were still very much talking about the language of architecture as we learned it coming out of schools, right? Folding, tectonics, imprinting. We were using the language of architecture to create the first generation of experiences. And the way we presented our work was very much about the diagram, about circulation, about all the things that you learn in architecture school that you're dying to do when you do your first big project. And so this is essentially the path that we took. And it taught us a lot of lessons. The whole idea of taking the context and making that the facade concept, I think was a very new idea back then. And the idea of imperfection. We were building in India, right? And concrete was the most imperfect material that was malleable, and we embraced it. And so these important lessons created this project that drew a lot of attention because of the way that it created spaces. we found that it was actually nature and the outdoors that made people happy. So talking back to the previous presentation, the concept of awe, the concept of emotions, this is when we realized that it was possible to create these kinds of experiences. And particularly interesting was the connection between the inside and the outside and bringing nature indoors, right? So this is the first part of the journey that we had. Fast forward again, another period between 2010 and 2015, what we call our second generation regenerative design, we started talking more about eco-awareness. We realized that if you don't understand nature, if you don't understand the importance of ecology, you don't really understand how to be regenerative, right? So we were starting to use nature paradigms as primary form generators, right? And moving away from traditional design language. We also found that reprogramming the user experience to create ecological encounters gave value, particularly real estate value, right? So in the St. Regis Maldives, which was our first real ecological eco-awareness project, we embraced nature. And this is when we realized that speaking the language of nature liberated us. We no longer had to rely simply on the traditional orthogonal Cartesian way of thinking. And it enabled us to create experiences or surprise and still have a very logical, very coherent type of design language. For example, in this image, the whole language came about from the ecology of this Maldivian island where the St. Regis is. It wasn't simply about talking about context in its most limiting forms. And the kind of feeling that you get there is not something that you can experience in a photograph. You actually have to be there and understand how these seemingly simplistic forms actually create conversations and particularly reaches a level of audience that I never thought possible. That's children, right? The kids loved it. And even the adults were drawn into the discussion. And that's when we understood that here we are, we now have a possibility of creating legacy, right? So in, every hotel you go to, you have this thing called the Kids Club. We decided not to call the Kids Club a Kids Club, but a nature discovery center. The design of the building took its inspiration from the banyan tree that was on site, but more importantly, what we created was a collision between architecture, programming, and user experience that was nature-based and evoked emotions for the whole family. This was a very successful strategy because now you could have conversations that children would ask their adults, hey, what is this all about? Where are we going? So this was a very revealing moment for us, 7, 8 years later, after the opening of this resort, it's still doing very well and it still creates a lot of conversation and we're very pleased about that. So it's about this discovery, how you can take the most common object or artifact or thing that you find and create a conversation out of it, whether it is just tumbled glass on the beach which is recycled into a chandelier or coconuts that are used in an artistic way. Now, what about the urban context? In urban context, you still have zoning codes, FAR. Sites are rectangular or squarish or some variation of that. How do you actually do regenerative design in such a context? Well, in places like India, where we have a lot of work, we took on this challenge and we realized it was not about the shape of the building that counted. It was how the user used the building or lived in the building, how transformative it was for them. So we started thinking about the concept of the citizen ecologist. Everybody who lives in this project has an opportunity to contribute. And we took the landscape concept, the ecological concept, and the user experience, and we linked it throughout the buildings. A series of stepped gardens, community gardens, took you up to a rooftop urban farm. And what this did was essentially, number one, created an opportunity for landscape and ecology to proliferate. And here we're talking not simply about planting, we're talking about insects, about avian species, about mammals, about insects, bees. So this educational and interactive community experience started building citizen awareness of how important the ecology is for everyone, right? And so when you have that, the community building gets much more intense, the discussions get more relevant, and you're building a legacy for the future. So these projects then took us into another realm of thinking, right? What we call our third generation regenerative design. And that is embracing regenerative design as the primary way to repair the built environment. And whole system ecological thinking, including bringing living systems and integrating it into the built environment. This is a whole different language of discussion. And to stop thinking about the building as an object, but as a substrate onto which living things grow or craft themselves or meld themselves, right? Reevaluating materials, daily materials, concrete, wood, steel, and thinking how to achieve the whole system design and engineering using materials. And this inevitably leads to climate and microclimate engineering. So, which brings me to this project I want to share with you, the Mandai Rainforest Resort. So some of you who may have been to Singapore, we started our journey 60 years ago as a garden city. And in the last 60 years, we have evolved ourselves to now being a city in nature. It is our agenda as a country and as a population to live closer to nature. How do you do that, right? And so the project that we were commissioned to do, having won an international design competition, is this eco resort, which is in the heart of Singapore, right? Singapore is a city-state, 274 kilometers. Our site is 126 hectares. It's a large site, and our eco resort, where you see the little green alphabet, is simply one small component of a much larger development where we have bird parks, nature attractions, etc. There's an existing zoo, an existing night safari, and the charge that we had was to build an attraction for everybody, not simply for the privileged, but for everybody. So this is the mission that we have. And the other thing that we wanted to do was to showcase our commitment to regeneration and to the environment. So the reason why we won the competition was the fact that we showed a building that would be enveloped and subsumed within nature, within the jungle, within 10 years, right? So these are photos that were just taken a few months ago, where you can see the building is sited to our drinking water, the reservoir of Singapore, but it has already achieved a certain sense of maturity, a certain sense of greenery. And the key design logic about the building was a nature paradigm. It was a vine, a liana, that creeps its way through the opportunities on the site. No specific form, opportunistic as nature is, right? And so this is architecture as a substrate, not object. And if you take a look at the site plan, you can see here that the idea is eventually you wouldn't even see the building at all. It would be completely absorbed into the jungle. This also required a change in the way we use the building, right? If you go to a typical zoo, this is next door to the Singapore Zoo, you have animals penned up safely, and you walk around and you gaze at the animals. Here we had a total paradigm reversal or shift. We put the people safely within the building, and we allowed the animals to roam around us. Quite the reversal on how we interact with nature. Normally you look at nature, but here nature looks back. So we not only designed it from a human's point of view, we designed it from the point of view of the real citizens and denizens of the jungle, how they would interact and look back at us. It was a revelational moment for us and a humbling moment for us, because we no longer spoke like architects or landscape architects. We needed to speak like ecologists, as people who embraced flora and fauna and understood about microbial activity, the value of soil, how important soil is, and how, if we understood the power of nature, we could harness it. We don't have any chemicals on this project to control mosquitoes. We actually used dragonflies. So we created a whole series of eco ponds where we encouraged the dragonflies to grow, and they were the natural mosquito killers. And this is important to us because at the end of the day, impacting the hearts and minds of the people and the future generations was much more important than any sort of architectural design statement that we were trying to make. The building receded into the background, and what was more important is how nature comes to the foreground. We were blown away. For example, within 3 weeks of opening, this bulbul family came to nest in the lobby and hatched younglings. It was a very humbling moment to see this, and how the people who saw this felt awe and felt healing and bought into the whole story. So I think this kind of attitude is really the heart and soul of what a regenerative design project is. Bringing the outdoors into the building, letting nature come in and create the dialogue and create the centerpiece of design. So what do we do, and how do we do this as architects responsibly? Singapore has no natural resources. Well, wait a minute, we actually did have natural resources. The trees that we cut down was a resource. So rather than sending it to the scrap heap, we recycled 100% of it, right? Even the tree bark, which we then turned into the formwork for the casting of the concrete, so that we imprinted the memory of the jungle, the actual vines onto the concrete, and became the experiential aspect of the project that was a living memory of the jungle. Diversity. Not just diversity from a humanistic point of view, but biodiversity forced us to think about universal access. Universal access not only for humans, but all the creatures of the jungle who were free to come into the resort, right? So be prepared for snakes. And it was all about internal spaces as well. What is an internal space in this regard? Well, we turned every room into a veranda. If you know what a veranda is, it's an indoor-outdoor room. And we gave the guests the choice to actually control the amount of energy they use. They could completely just live with the warmth, or they could augment it with cooling. And so we wanted to give choice the responsibility of the energy utilization. Now, part of the resort is a typical hotel room. There are 338 keys here, but 24 of them were tree houses. And the tree houses took on a metaphorical narrative aspect, which is, in this case, the seed pod. And what we wanted to do here was to use the seed pod as a mnemonic device that spoke about the opportunity of being in tune with nature, right? So these tree houses are elevated on stilts. They occupy the deepest, densest part of the jungle. And at the end of the day, it was also an opportunity to showcase technologies that have been around for a very long time that maybe we took for granted. We used passive displacement ventilation in this case. It wasn't about the regular air conditioning system. Your body heat generated convection currents that cooled the room and used 40% less energy, if you decided to use it. It wasn't about cooling the space, it was about cooling you, the occupant. The other thing that was very important to us was embracing all kinds of conditions. It's called a rainforest resort for a reason. It rains a lot. And we wanted it to be as beautiful in the rain as it was in the heat. And water as a resource was educational. We wanted the children in particular to see that water could be harvested, could be collected. So, talking about the sustainability initiatives, it's Singapore's first super low energy resort. Solar, of course, rainwater harvesting, of course, but more importantly, what we wanted to do was to create a whole system ecology within the building, right? So 6 months into it, it's already pretty lush. 10 years later, we hope the building won't even be seen. And so this requires us to really have planned for the ecosystem that would come back to it. Certain animals, like colugos, are residents of particular trees. You cut down that tree, that guy may never come back again. So this is a very key understanding that we have. When you speak the language of nature, you have to be sensitive to a lot more than just humanity and human beings. So I'll come now to the final part of what I want to share with you today, looking forward into the future, right? So these are statistics which we did some research on. Global building floor area is expected to triple by 2060. That is the equivalent of adding an entire New York City every month for 40 years. And a lot of this is going on in Asia and in the Middle East. Forest coverage is at a tipping point, right? We have 1/3 of the planet's land, right? And the net loss per year is still more than anything we can plant back artificially. So we're experiencing the loss of our forest coverage every year, year by year, right? But we can't stop building, can we? After all, everyone deserves a home, right? We can't expect the people in Africa or in India to not be urbanized. So what do we do now? Recognizing the need to totally review existing policies and practices and repurposing the economic equation in the built environment is a thing that we all have to do. We really need to relook at all of this in order to achieve regenerative design outcomes. Exploring, researching, and testing policies and paradigms to create wholesome built environments by going back to basics. This is a must-do. So I would encourage architects, landscape architects to work together and go back to basics and relook at how we do the built environment, right? And so we at WOW, we want to embrace unique projects that allow us to test these ideas, right? And by bringing humans ever closer to nature, by positively changing and transforming their attributes to nature through this sort of through the climate crisis, articulating a new design aesthetic and language where human achievement is subsumed within the language of nature, not simply the language of design that we're used to. So climate, resources, land use, coastal development, these are issues of urbanization as we build cities, particularly along coastlines, as sea levels begin to rise, more and more violent hurricanes and typhoons come along. We really need to rethink how we do the physical placemaking that will inevitably come. So taking our lessons that we have learned a lot in Singapore, the one good thing about Singapore, as some of you who know who have been there, is we have strong government and we have strong government involvement in the built environment. So this has forced Singapore architects to really get involved, improving the quality of one's life, strengthening economic resilience. Economic resilience is very, very important for the built environment, right? Evolving urban ecosystems. Natural ecosystems, we know, but urban ecosystems, morphology, the word of the shape of the city is very important. Fostering communities in nature. Singapore has 320 kilometers of nature trails in our small little island, Leading industry transformation. How can architects, through the discussions we have in industry, affect the outcome of the construction industry that we depend on to do our work? So these are conversations that I think need to be had in order for us to create cities in nature. All cities should be cities in nature in order for us to create new global benchmarks. New global benchmarks, I think, is what we need. And, this is a diagram that says a lot, I think, in every city. Building envelope controls are pretty standard in many urban environments. The planning regulations dictate what you can build. But what if we were able to deconstruct it using other criteria? Climate, for example, bringing user space up into different levels, sort of rejigging the jigsaw so that we created a much more inclusive and open sort of architecture that utilizes resources. So I think the Venn diagram here says a lot about measurable building performance. I think a lot of green technology that is in the pipeline or that has already been used is measurable. And what we need to do is use the measurable outcome, and this is why I'm so looking forward to AI, is to apply that back to design and the performance of the building into the future to create these regenerative outcomes. And we need to incentivize the developer. No one's going to do anything for nothing. And so if we give them enough incentive, particularly to the developing countries where planning regulations are much more backward, I think you will see good outcomes. So for the projects that we're doing in places like India, in Indonesia, government agencies need to partner. We need to partner with them to create these sort of new ways of thinking in order to create the reward system to encourage them to be regenerative. So right now in Singapore, we used to think 50 years in advance. We thought that was enough. But if you're looking at planetary change, like cutting back 2 degrees centigrade, for example, 50 years is not enough. You have to plan for 100 years. And all of us are involved. You are the citizen ecologists, and your clients and the end users of your projects, they're all participants in this. And so we think that, well, in Singapore, we aim at, while we are promoting this, cooling the whole island. Imagine being able to cool the whole city, because then you can really combat climate change. It's not building at a time, it's a city at a time, right? So what will this look like? I think this is when design is really powerful to create visualizations of new ways of living in these urban morphologies that we could create. 3-dimensional green cities that could really change the way we look at habitats, ourselves included, right? We also have some interesting projects now in coastal areas and in remote locations like islands, where we now not only go in and develop islands, we create islands out of blue ocean, literally blue ocean technology, where we have the opportunity to not only design on the terrestrial aspect, but even in the marine aspect. Land is like a pyramid. Just the tip of the land above the ocean is what we deal with. What happens to everything else underwater? It's a continuity. So architects stop thinking at the coastline, but we shouldn't. We should continue our thought down into the oceans, because that's where life is. And so in our projects now, we now think about how we can address underwater environments as well, planting underwater gardens that regenerate coral reefs. So I think this sort of thinking that is a much broader scale of imagination about the possibilities, the engineering required is really going to be the forefront for what we do. When it comes to building buildings, it is no longer enough to think about the building envelope as a climate-controlled device, but we have to rethink thermal comfort completely by thinking in a mixed mode cooling methodology from the ocean through the landscape up into the building, right? So our projects now take on a much more ambitious approach, where we are not cooling the space per se, but cooling the occupants in the space using various passive and active technologies for the thermal comfort. So to conclude, I think this says it all, Sir David Attenborough. We know the problems, and what we do next is really up to each and every one of us. Thank you.
Chiu Man, thank you very much for that. And a lot of ground to cover. Can I ask you first, are you broadly optimistic? I mean, obviously a 100-year plan is going to be way beyond either of our lifetimes, but do you think that the impetus behind even thinking about a 100-year plan, does that make you optimistic?
Well, you can hear me. I guess I don't need this. There's always this saying that you don't plant a tree to sit underneath it. You plant it for the next generation. And I think that's the mindset that if you really want to solve the climate crisis, you just can't think about the here and now. You have to think beyond. So I am optimistic, I would say, because I have no choice. You have no choice. We all have no choice. If you love your children and your grandchildren, you'll be thinking way down the line.
And from Singapore's point of view, you have a very dirigiste government, very interested in the built environment. What are the drivers behind current thinking about what should happen. I mean, for example, that idea that when you create a new building that you should actually replace the ground you're losing with terraces and gardens, so that in a sense buildings do sit on the land lightly because the land is actually recreated there. I mean, is that sort of thinking now being pushed to new levels?
I think that when we started this whole idea of a city in nature, we were coming from 50-year-old, at least 50-year-old planning policies that came out of traditional Western economic models and, particularly British town planning as an ex-colony, right? But as we have evolved as a nation state, we realized that considering our situation where we have limited resources, particularly land, we had to rethink. But economic resilience is putting economics first. So the built environment is struggling to catch up, quite honestly, right? So I think the task that the Singapore architect has is, number one, optimism. Number two, using data-driven and business-driven thinking to affect policy. It's not simply because I like it and I thought of it and I could design it. It needs to be justified.
And how do you justify the effect on or the amenity provided in respect of natural resources? I mean, this is a familiar dilemma, which I know you yourself discussed. I mean, doing an eco resort in the jungle, some people would say, well, why do a resort at all? And I know that public policy said it was going to happen anyway. The question was whether it was going to be good or bad. How's that sort of thing being addressed?
Well, in particular for the Mandai project, there was objection. There was. It wasn't a plain sailing situation. So in Singapore now, we don't just implement policy. Those days are gone, right? We are a democracy, and we believe in public opinion and public feedback. So we conduct workshops, we have focus groups, and we slowly tease out the ideas and persuade people. That's why we plan 50 years in advance, so we have reaction time.
Have you got any models for cities that have done very long-term plans? I mean, the only one I can think of is Amsterdam, where they had a 100-year plan from the 1920s, and actually, at its core, it seems to have survived quite well. I wonder if there are any Asian examples.
Well, I think there are plenty. China, for one, the whole country, I don't know how loudly you may have heard this, they're planning a generation or two ahead. I mean, the presentation that Daniel gave today about his project in China is talking about a mega scale thinking that incorporates 40, 50 million people at a shot. So they do think at enormous scale and over enormous periods.
And do you think that at that level of scale that actually a response to nature and the environmental impacts of that as a driver, is it possible if you're working at that scale and with the sort of concomitant scale of increase of population, or even if it's not increasing actually like that, the numbers are increasing?
The Great Wall of China still stands today. The Grand Canal is still there today. I think it's proven that you can do it, right? So the question is, do you have the political will, the people behind you, and long-range enough thinking to do it?
You suggested that architecture and landscape and ecology need to be seen as a kind of really synthesized whole in the delivery of the built environment. How does your office work? Do you work with ecologists and biologists? Do you bring them in? Do you employ any yourself?
Well, one of the most significant things that Maria did in the last decade of her life was to completely rebuild the way the office works. Yes, we used to have architects, interior designers, landscape architects, and COVID was a very important period. We were forced to downsize. And in that period, we couldn't afford that many people, and that's when we had a revelation. Actually, it makes a lot more sense to jumble everyone together to be creative, to really think of it as like a SWAT team, so to speak, right? In any team that we now have architects, landscape architects, ecologists. We have on tap all sorts of domain expertise, including AI, that we utilize as resources in order to think outside the box.
And what projects are you doing at the moment that would be examples of that? Was the eco resort an example of it, actually?
Yeah, the eco resort, as I said, was our third gen type project. Yes, in 2017 when we started it, was the beginning of this great revelation. Today, in 2025, the projects that we're doing would be in places like India, in the Maldives, in Indonesia, where we have taken this bull by the horns and really now working on an advisory level on policy. It's not simply enough. When the brief and the budget comes to you as the architect, everything is locked in. Now we want to engage at policy making level in the land acquisition, the conditions of acquisition, working with the local government to see how we can influence policy in order to reshape the project.
I think in Singapore, this is quite a big debate, isn't it? Because the people who traditionally have been responsible for that might consult, but the idea that the architectural profession will become, as it were, a kind of politicized player in those discussions is something a bit different, because architects traditionally have not been political, certainly not with a big P. In Singapore or other places, I mean, in the UK, for example, the only architect with any political influence for 50 years was Richard Rogers. That was it. There's nobody now who's kind of advising government at a strategic policy level. What's happening in Singapore?
Well, we certainly have influential architects like Liu Taike, whose son Daniel is here today. Sorry to put you on the spot, Daniel. But we do have people who are able to work at that level. But I don't think it's about the individual. I think it's at the professional level, what we teach in schools, how we articulate the problem, and how we influence is important. I mean, when I was at Harvard, I always say this to all my staff, the one thing I learned was how to be political. It wasn't just about good design, it was how you sold an idea and why it was the relevant solution.
And do you think when I looked at the Singapore, I think 2040 plan, and now with this 100-year plan, this looked pretty far-reaching. I mean, it seemed to have involved a lot of consultation. How do you think it's faring? And are the regulatory regimes associated with all governments and built environments, are they being considered at the same time as the strategic planning is being thought about? Are they in harness?
Well, I think Singapore is the rare example in Southeast Asia or in Asia, right? If you looked in other developing countries where the vast majority of those cities are being built today, India, the Philippines, Indonesia, I think there's a lot less involvement of the profession with politics, and politics is often corrupt and short-term, right? And I think it falls back to private sector, particularly, to engage with public sector. And that's why I have great hope on PPP type projects where we can, at a larger scale, create outcomes. Anything to do with an airport would be a prime example, or a technology park, special economic zone, for example. The latest Biake's project, right? The Singapore government has sent our mandarins, our bureaucrats, to help the King of Bhutan think through. And the GMC project is a special administrative zone. That's a very good example of how this sort of mentality can be used to affect, it's 5% of Bhutan, that project, how that could be influential.
I want to turn to something where Singapore's been particularly successful and get your view on provision of affordable housing. Because actually, although there wasn't much in your presentation, you've done plenty of housing projects. Is the drive of Singapore to build for an increasing population, is that ambition still alive and well?
I don't know how many of you know this, but about 70 to 80% of Singaporeans live in public housing. And that has been the strongest stabilizing force that keeps our party, the People's Action Party, in power, and what drives the entire economic engine. The fact that we have a high rate of savings and we have ownership, home ownership, and we're stable. So I would say that for countries that are coming into the development curve and hoping to move up in their GDP, right? This is a very important strategy. Proper housing, water, having access to clean water, right? All these things are such simple, basic building blocks of any civilization that we must have it.
Because in the early years, after post-independence, the emphasis and the drive was basically on numbers, wasn't it? It was the use of concrete systems, and you could have said, well, it's quite East European. Now that has all changed, and there are lots of upgrades going on because those buildings are coming to the end of their useful lives. There's a lot of regenerative work going on. But what I'm wondering is, with new things and regeneration of the existing, whether the ecological agenda is being introduced as a kind of new element, which was less important than the main thing was to do some numbers so people could actually live in something approaching decency.
That's very true. I think that this whole drive for the city in nature is the understanding now by our government, the Singapore government, that nature is healing. It brings people together. It builds for better places, and it deals with the upcoming and some of the most recent generations of work-life balance, for example. Where do you go when you have island fever, right? We don't want you to run away from Singapore. We have to provide you with recreation. And so this is also what we have found in places like India, where, there's a lot of small land ownership. And when you consolidate parcels, the landscape is almost like a dressing on top, right? And so I think this issue of nature healing and how nature should integrate is nothing unique to Singapore. It affects us all. We live on one planet, and it's nature that links us all together.
But there is a sense in which, historically, certain in Western culture, the idea of man dominating nature, all those wonderful French gardens, it's a relatively recent idea that actually they're terrible and they should let them just go wild. The whole rewilding phenomenon that's taking place all over Europe, reintroducing bears and eagles and all that kind of stuff. I just wonder whether, as an architect who obviously creates the man-made, whether you see actually a kind of philosophical conflict between that notion of the great building, the great act of a mind, as opposed to the informal, uncontrollable, sensational aspects of nature itself.
Yes, there definitely is a conflict. As a person of Chinese ancestry and as a person who has studied Chinese gardens, the one thing I can say about the Chinese interpretation of nature is control. Hence, Singapore has a strong controlling hand, even in nature. And if you're talking about rewilding and a much more pastoral, and somebody like Teddy Roosevelt would have seen, right, where you live in harmony with big nature, I think that is an ongoing debate that some of my friends and colleagues in bigger countries would have, where you can't control everything, neither should you want to do so. But the question is, what is that fringe where you have this interaction? There, I think a certain amount of control will be required.
Finally, can I ask you, on the eco resort, were you surprised by the way that, having visited it myself, the way that, not just planting, but animals and insects, etc., seem to have taken off. I mean, it hasn't been there terribly long. I mean, a year, maybe less. But I did get the impression that nature was almost starting to take control of certain areas, and I wonder if that's an illusion on my. Maybe I wanted it to be so, or whether actually what you were hoping for has happened, and any surprises.
Well, for those of you who have seen Jurassic Park, yeah, nature is like that. It takes over faster than you think. It comes back. And I think what we need to learn is how to live with it, work with it, control it to some extent. But if we try to draw the boundaries too tight, and if we don't understand the science of it, we could inadvertently kill the very thing that we want.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on, even though it's a rather gloomy one. But on the other hand, it certainly fits into the theme of hearts and minds. I mean, nature needs to be minded, shall we say, by the mindful. Wong Chiu Man, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.